This video will look at the just war theory. Just war theory relates to study 4, crises and responses. In particular, it's important to look at just war theory when talking about intra and interstate conflict. So what is it? Well, this theory was created based on Christian principles. It's a philosophy that explores under what circumstances can war occur and whether war can ever be justified. Under this philosophy, it has been said that war can be justified when a state or an actor needs to defend themselves, when they're seeking a particular type of change, when sovereignty might be threatened, or as an ethical response to protect others. In addition, this theory tries to reconcile 3 things in particular. 1, that taking human life is seriously wrong. 2, that states have a duty to defend their citizens and to seek justice. And 3, protecting innocent life and defending important moral values sometimes requires a willingness to use force and violence through war. As well as this, the theory also explores some of the conventions and rules of warfare. Here is an overview of some of the principles stated under just war theory. They include just cause, last resort, and legitimate authority. Each will be looked at in more detail. Under the just cause principle, this explores some of the causes under which conventional warfare can be justified. And the 3 standard causes are self-defense, recovery of stolen assets, and punishment for wrongdoing. In particular, for our course, we're interested in just cause and self-defense. So if we look at the example of Iraq and the Iraq War, America used this principle to justify their need to invade and occupy Iraq. This was because the US believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and thus they used this to justify going to war, stating that they were defending themselves against a potential threat, hence self-defense. A self-defense against a threat to their national interest. Last resort is the principle with the belief that before turning to war, all reasonable approaches to a peaceful resolution need to be employed, so that war is the last resort taken by a state. Again, in terms of the Iraq War, it's been argued by critics of the invasion that America should have explored other possible resolutions to the crisis, to the standoff between the US and Saddam. Other solutions such as more diplomatic means. To counter this argument, the Bush administration has claimed that they took other forms of action. They took the action of war very reluctantly and as the last means of action. They had already attempted diplomacy through the UN Security Council, but with little effect. Legitimate authority involves requiring that only legitimate officials or actors could decide to resort to force in order to protect themselves. This is a more contentious element of just war theory because it begs the question, who has legitimate authority to go to war? When regarding the justification for the Iraq War, the US clearly argued that they had the legitimate authority to defend themselves, that their sovereignty and their right to protect their people and their borders meant that they needed to defend themselves and were authorised to defend themselves from possible weapons of mass destruction. Peaceful intentions refers to the intention to use force in order to achieve peace, and that the force used will be restrained or the minimal force necessary. The US claimed that in order to liberate Iraq and bring peace and democracy, they would use the minimal amount of force needed to remove Saddam Hussein from power and establish a democratic government in its place. Finally, reasonable hope for success suggests that in going to war, there must exist some sort of reasonable expectation that the side going to war believes it will successfully obtain peace and reconciliation between the warring parties. Of course, America, given its enormous military power, believed they had a strong chance that they would succeed. They believed they would quickly defeat the Iraqi army, very easily overthrow Saddam Hussein, and establish a peaceful and democratic state. We now know in hindsight that in fact success was far more difficult because of the nature of asymmetric warfare. Success was very limited in this particular conflict. So ultimately, when looking at when to refer to this particular theory, it's useful to use this theory to talk about inter and intrastate conflicts, and anytime you're referring to the Iraq War, especially the causes of war, you might refer to just war theory to explain or better show an understanding of why the US went to war and what its justifications were.